It is a cold morning in March of 1571, and a young Flemish man named Charles Bailey has just stepped off a boat at Dover. He is nervous. He has reason to be. Hidden somewhere in his luggage is a packet of letters, roughly 200 of them, all in cipher, all destined for a man in London. He almost makes it through customs. The moment he is arrested, something begins to unravel. Not just a plan, but a web of ambitions, stretching from an English nobleman's great house all the way to the Vatican, to the court of Philip II in Madrid, to the corridors of a government that was quietly watching and quietly waiting. One young man at a port, and an entire conspiracy starts to come apart. Welcome to Cozy Crime, historical crime to fall asleep to. This is episode 23, the Ridolfi plot, and tonight I want to take you through the most consequential conspiracy of Elizabethan England, the people it destroyed, the one man it left entirely unharmed, and the question historians are still quietly arguing about. Get comfortable, settle in, and let the 16th century come to you gently. Before I take you deeper into this story, I want to say one thing about the sources. William Cecil's government controlled much of the documentary record from this period. The state papers, the correspondence, the records of interrogations, all of it was produced by people with their own agendas and their own reasons to shape what survived. That doesn't mean we can't trust the historical record. It means we should hold it thoughtfully, and I'll try to do that throughout tonight's episode. Now, let me tell you about Thomas Howard. In 1571, Thomas Howard was the 4th Duke of Norfolk, and he was England's only duke, not one of several. The only one. His was the single highest non-royal title in the entire kingdom, and he wore it with the particular ease of a man who had never known life without exceptional privilege. His estates were vast. His annual income placed him among the wealthiest men in the country by a considerable distance. He had a great house in London, properties scattered across East Anglia, a name that commanded attention in any room he entered. If you had looked at Thomas Howard in, say, 1568, and been asked to identify the man most likely to die on Tower Hill, you would not have chosen him. He had survived, which was no small thing. He came of age during the reign of the young King Edward VI, a period when men of his class fell with alarming regularity if they misjudged the shifting Protestant politics of the Regency court. He navigated that. Then came the brief reign of Queen Mary I, a Catholic restoration, another set of loyalties to manage, another court to read correctly. He navigated that too. Then Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, and Thomas Howard settled into the role of England's greatest nobleman with what appeared to be perfectly sustainable dignity. He was part of the furniture of power. He mattered in the way that men of his rank and wealth almost inevitably mattered, and he seemed to know it. But Thomas Howard had a particular kind of ambition that his wealth and rank, paradoxically, had done nothing to satisfy. He wanted to matter in a different way. He wanted to be central, not decorative. He wanted his name attached not just to great estates, but to the direction of the kingdom. And sometime in the late 1560s, he became convinced that marrying Mary Queen of Scots was his destiny. Mary's situation by 1571 was one of the stranger legal arrangements in 16th century Europe. She had fled Scotland in May of 1568 after a series of disasters, including the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, a marriage to the man widely suspected of the murder, a rebellion by Scottish lords, and her own forced abdication. She crossed into England expecting sanctuary, possibly expecting help in reclaiming her throne. What she got instead was captivity. Not a prison exactly, not a trial. Simply house arrest in one comfortable manor after another, guarded, watched, surrounded by servants who reported to Elizabeth's council. She had never been formally charged with anything. She was held in a legal gray zone that Cecil's council found genuinely uncomfortable, and that Elizabeth herself seemed unable to resolve one way or another. By 1571, she had been in this peculiar limbo for 3 years. She was also, by any measure, a genuinely dangerous political presence, and not because of who she was personally, but because of what she represented. She was Catholic. She had a claim to the English throne through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor. She was young, she was charming, she was sympathetic in a way that made her a natural focal point for anyone who wanted an alternative to Elizabeth. And Thomas Howard, England's only duke, had decided that marrying her would make him the man who stabilized England, who bridged the religious divide, who secured the succession. His friends told him this was extraordinarily dangerous. His family told him. He was warned, more than once and more than gently. He went ahead anyway. He convinced himself that his rank, his intentions, and his irreplaceability would protect him from consequences that had destroyed lesser men. He thought he was the exception. That error, so recognizable, so human, is really the heart of his story. He had actually already attracted suspicion once. In 1569, he was loosely connected to an earlier scheme to marry Mary and was briefly held in the Tower as a precaution. He was released. He was warned again. He still didn't stop. Which brings me to Roberto Ridolfi, who arrived in this story not as a trained spy or a hardened conspirator, but as a Florentine banker with very good social connections and an extraordinary amount of nerve. Ridolfi had been in England for some years, working in the financial networks that connected the great Catholic houses of Europe. He moved through elite Catholic circles with the ease of a man who understood that money and religion in the 16th century occupied the same social space. He had charm. He had access. He had contacts at the Vatican and at the Spanish court. And by 1570, looking at the landscape of Elizabethan England, he saw what he believed was a very large opportunity. The landscape had shifted considerably in February of 1570, when Pope Pius V issued a papal bull called Regnans in Excelsis. The bull formally excommunicated Elizabeth I and, crucially, released all English Catholics from their allegiance to her. What that meant in practice was something more troubling still. It gave theological permission for her removal by force. The Pope had not named a method, but the implication was clear enough. For Philip II of Spain, who had his own ambitions in Northern Europe and his own long-standing interest in the English question, the bull provided a religious framework within which funding an invasion of England could be framed not as naked political aggression, but as something approaching a holy obligation. For ordinary English Catholics, the bull was a different kind of disaster. It placed them between two loyalties, their faith and their queen, with no clean way to honor both. Most of them, the overwhelming majority, chose their queen. They were loyal to Elizabeth, went to their parish churches, paid their taxes, and lived with the private tension of their beliefs. But plots like the one Ridolfi was assembling made every English Catholic a suspect, and that suspicion had consequences that would accumulate for decades. Ridolfi understood the political moment. He understood that the Northern Rebellion of 1569, arising by Catholic earls in the north of England that had collapsed quickly and without a major battle, had nevertheless demonstrated to the Spanish and the papacy that there was genuine Catholic sentiment in England willing to act. The embers were there. He proposed to fan them. His plan, in its broad outlines, was this. Thomas Howard would marry Mary Queen of Scots, the Duke of Alba, Spain's formidable military governor in the Netherlands, would land a force of around 6,000 soldiers on the English coast. An internal Catholic uprising would follow, Elizabeth would be removed, and England would return to the Catholic fold. Mary would be queen, Norfolk would be king in all but name. Ridolfi would be, presumably, very well rewarded. Ridolfi personally lobbied the Pope and Philip II. He traveled, he met with the great powers, he spoke with confidence about the English Catholics who would rise, the ports where the invasion force could land, the ease with which the whole enterprise would succeed. Standing on the other side of all of this, patient and methodical and deeply suspicious, was William Cecil. Cecil had been Elizabeth's principal secretary since the first days of her reign. He was not a glamorous figure. He was not the brilliant theatrical spymaster of popular imagination. That role in popular history tends to fall to Francis Walsingham, who would have his great moment 15 years later. Cecil's genius was different. It was quiet, practical, and almost forensic. He watched things. He let conspiracies breathe and grow before he moved, gathering evidence, building cases, waiting for the moment of maximum political utility. The historian Stephen Alford describes his approach as patient, methodical, and deeply suspicious, and I think that's exactly right. Cecil didn't crush problems, he harvested them. He had actually arrested Ridolfi briefly in 1569, after the Northern Rebellion, and then apparently he let him go. That release, as we'll return to later, is either the most significant intelligence failure of Cecil's career, or something far more calculated. Either way, Ridolfi walked free, and by the spring of 1571, the conspiracy was in motion. Everything that was needed was in place. The papal bull had given ideological cover. Philip II was, at least in theory, interested. Norfolk was in correspondence with the conspirators. Mary had authorized Ridolfi to act on her behalf, though how clearly she understood the violent elements of the plan is something historians have argued about ever since. The scholarly consensus, led by John Guy's careful research, is that Mary knew an invasion was planned and that Elizabeth might be killed. She was complicit, knowingly so, though she was not the architect of the scheme, and Ridolfi appears to have been careful to give her just enough deniability to work with. And then, in March of 1571, a young man named Charles Bailey stepped off a boat at Dover, and everything changed. Bailey was Flemish, Catholic, and in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Or perhaps he was exactly the person someone had been watching for. He was carrying the letters, roughly 200 of them in cipher, addressed to John Leslie, the Bishop of Ross, who was Mary's own ambassador to the English court. The letters were the documentary spine of the entire conspiracy. They contained coded instructions, coded contacts, coded evidence of everything Ridolfi had been building. Bailey was taken to the Marshalsea prison. Initial questioning produced nothing useful. Then he was subjected to torture on the rack. He broke. The names and codes he gave his interrogators pointed directly toward the Bishop of Ross. John Leslie, the Bishop of Ross, was in a position that would have been agonizing for a man of any loyalty. He was Mary's representative. He owed his position and his safety to her cause. He had been part of this conspiracy. And now, Cecil's men were at his door with everything Bailey had told them. Leslie was arrested, questioned, and then, in the account that historians have found most startling, he confessed to everything. Not some things. Everything. He named Norfolk. He named the contacts. He described the plan. And he reportedly told his interrogators something even more damning than the names of conspirators. that Mary herself was unworthy of trust. Mary's own ambassador, a bishop, a man whose entire function was to serve and protect her, said this to the men who were trying to destroy her. What goes on inside a person at a moment like that, I'm not sure we can fully know. Leslie was afraid. The rack was real, the threat was real. The consequences of silence were real. People tell themselves many things when they are frightened and in pain. But the completeness of his betrayal, the willingness not just to protect himself but to actively discredit the queen he served, sits uncomfortably even now. His confession was, functionally, the act that sealed Norfolk's fate. After Leslie named Norfolk, Cecil's agents moved. They went to Howard House, Norfolk's great London residence, and they searched it. What they found, hidden beneath the tiles of an outhouse in the grounds, was a cipher key, not a letter, not a document, with Norfolk's handwriting on it, making claims he could dispute or contextualize. A codebook, the precise tool needed to decode every piece of correspondence between Norfolk and the conspirators. Norfolk had buried it rather than burned it. That single decision, so strange and so consequential, became the hinge on which his entire case turned. Why didn't he destroy it? That question doesn't have a good answer. It's possible he buried it in a moment of panic and then told himself he would deal with it later. It's possible he genuinely couldn't bring himself to believe things had gone this far. It's possible that some part of him, the part that had convinced himself he was the exception, couldn't quite accept that he needed to take that final precaution. Whatever the reason, the cipher key was found, and Norfolk had no way to account for it. He was arrested. He denied everything at first, which was not unusual. Denial was the standard opening move. Then, as the evidence was laid before him, he began to admit to knowing about the plot, then to minimizing his role within it. The cipher key under the tiles made minimization impossible. Norfolk was tried for high treason on the 16th of January, 1572. The evidence was comprehensive. The verdict was not in doubt. He was convicted and sentenced to death. And then, Elizabeth couldn't sign the warrant. She signed it once and recalled it. She signed it a second time and recalled it again. For 4 months, from January to June of 1572, England's only duke sat in the Tower with a conviction against his name, and a queen who seemed unable to commit to the final act. Cecil and the council were, by several accounts, beside themselves. Elizabeth had a well-documented difficulty with the execution of people of royal or noble blood. It wasn't weakness exactly, or not only weakness. There was something visceral in her resistance to it, something that went beyond political calculation. She seemed genuinely to find it hard, in a way she apparently didn't find it hard with commoners, and that human detail matters. She knew what she needed to do. She kept failing to do it. It is Cecil, by most accounts, who finally resolved the impasse, not by impatience or argument, but by laying out the ongoing danger in explicit terms. Every day Norfolk lived was another day the conspiracy could restart. Every day Mary remained at the center of it all was a day Elizabeth remained at risk. The logic was not complicated. It was just difficult to hear. Norfolk walked to Tower Hill on the 2nd of June, 1572. He was, by contemporary accounts, composed. He was 46 years old. He was the first duke to be executed since the Duke of Somerset in 1552, and he would be the last for many generations. England's wealthiest man, its only duke, a man who had survived 3 monarchs and been warned repeatedly and simply couldn't stop himself, died on a summer morning for a plot that had never come close to operational reality. At that exact moment, Roberto Ridolfi was in Florence. He had left England in March of 1571 before any of the arrests. He had meetings to attend, kings and popes to lobby, plans to finalize. He never came back. Whether he didn't come back because he was already in flight, or because he simply had no reason to return once the machinery of the plan was supposedly in motion, isn't entirely clear. What is clear is that he was safely across the Channel long before Charles Bailey was arrested at Dover, and that he stayed safely across the Channel for the rest of a very long life. He was in Florence when the arrest started. He was in Florence when the Bishop of Ross confessed. He was in Florence when the cipher key was found under the tiles at Howard House. He was in Florence when Norfolk was convicted. He was in Florence on the 2nd of June, 1572. England sent letters. The Medici rulers of Florence declined to act on them. And that, for Ridolfi, was that. He entered the Florentine Senate in 1600. He died in 1612. He outlived Norfolk by 40 years. He outlived Mary, Queen of Scots, who was eventually executed in 1587 by 25 years. He outlived Elizabeth I, who died in 1603. He outlived William Cecil, who died in 1598. Ridolfi, the man who organized the most consequential conspiracy of the Elizabethan age, outlived every single person who had tried to stop him, every person who had suffered in his place, and every person who had been his intended target. That is not a comfortable fact to sit with. It is, however, the fact. Now the Duke of Alba, the Spanish general who was supposed to lead the invasion force, had his own private opinion of Ridolfi's scheme. In correspondence with Philip II, he wrote, in substance, that Ridolfi talked too much, revealed too much to too many people, and that the plan had no serious military foundation. Alba was Spain's best general. He had fought in the Netherlands with exceptional effectiveness and considerable brutality. He understood military logistics in a way that Ridolfi, a banker by trade, clearly did not. He refused to commit to the invasion on the terms Ridolfi proposed. The conspiracy was thus undermined not only by English intelligence, not only by the cascading betrayals of Bailey and Leslie, but by the skepticism of Spain's own most capable military mind. The plot was, in Alba's assessment, poorly conceived from the beginning. Which brings me to the question that I think is the most surprising thing in this entire story, and I want to be careful here because it is genuinely unproven. It is a compelling, thoughtfully argued, not widely accepted scholarly hypothesis, and I want to give it exactly that weight, no more and no less. The historian John Bosse, in a book called Under the Molehill, published by Yale University Press in 2001, advanced a serious argument that Roberto Ridolfi may have been working as an informant for William Cecil from as early as 1569, the year Cecil had him briefly arrested and then, with what Bosse considers suspicious speed, released. If that is true, then the most dangerous Catholic conspiracy of Elizabeth's reign was, at least in part, a government operation. Cecil may not just have caught the conspiracy. He may have built it, or allowed it to build, the better to harvest it at the moment of maximum political utility. The circumstantial evidence Bosse points to includes several things worth naming. Cecil's remarkably quick release of Ridolfi in 1569 sits oddly with his general pattern of patience and suspicion. Cecil's apparent awareness of the plot's progress at every stage seems, at moments, almost too complete to be the work of reactive intelligence. And the convenient timing of each arrest, beginning with Bailey at Dover at precisely the moment when the conspiracy had gathered enough evidence to condemn everyone involved, has the feel, if you read it a certain way, of a carefully chosen moment rather than a fortunate interception. Most mainstream historians, including John Guy and Stephen Alford, acknowledge Bossy's argument as interesting and worth taking seriously, but they stop short of accepting it as proven. The primary sources simply don't give us enough certainty to call it settled. Cecil's government controlled the documentary record, and a genuinely covert operation of that kind would not have left clean written traces. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the presence of circumstantial patterns is not the same as proof. But for us, sitting with this story at some distance from 1571, the ambiguity is, I think, the point. It matters that we cannot be certain. It matters that the man who may have been the spider at the center of the web, the man whose patient methodology shaped every significant political moment of Elizabeth's early reign, may have been operating at a level of strategic depth that the historical record cannot quite confirm or deny. The uncertainty is not a failure of the history, it is the history. Mary, Queen of Scots, remained a prisoner in England after the Ridolfi plot collapsed. Parliament was not subtle about what it thought should happen to her. The English Parliament voted to exclude her from the succession and petitioned Elizabeth directly for her execution. Elizabeth refused both measures. She would not execute an anointed queen. That was, I think, a principled position, and I want to resist the temptation to read it primarily as political weakness or emotional indecision, though it was surely complicated by both. There was something genuine in Elizabeth's refusal, a belief, held against considerable political pressure, that the execution of an anointed monarch set a precedent that no crown could afford. That refusal held for 16 years. Mary remained in captivity, moving from house to house, watched and guarded, writing letters and receiving them, remaining a focal point for every Catholic plotter who needed a name to rally around. Another conspiracy, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, used her name. Then the Babington plot of 1586. And that one was finally specific enough, final enough, documented enough, to force Elizabeth's hand. Mary was tried and executed in February of 1587. By that point, she had been a prisoner in England for nearly 19 years. The cost of Elizabeth's principled refusal was those years of ongoing danger, those years of conspiracy building around a focal point Elizabeth had declined to remove. Whether it was the right decision is a question historians have been debating ever since, and I don't think there is a clean answer. Principles, particularly royal ones, have consequences that reach far beyond the moment of decision. The Ridolfi plot tells us something, I think, about a particular pattern in political history, the pattern of who actually bears the weight when conspiracies go wrong. Norfolk was complicit, genuinely so, and he had been warned and had chosen to proceed. His guilt was real. But he was also, in some meaningful sense, an instrument rather than an architect, a man of dynastic ambition who was handed a scheme already designed by someone else and invited to play the central role. Ridolfi, who designed the scheme, negotiated its international support, and set it in motion, never spent a single day in an English prison. Norfolk died on Tower Hill. Ridolfi became a senator. Mary, who authorized the plot while maintaining plausible deniability about its violent elements, spent 16 more years imprisoned, then died on a scaffold in Fotheringhay. Ridolfi attended civic functions in Florence. Charles Bailey, a young courier doing a job he had been asked to do, spent time on the rack in the Marshalsea and gave up names under torture. Ridolfi sat in his study, presumably comfortable, presumably aware that the whole thing had gone wrong, and stayed where he was. That gap between guilt and consequence is not unique to 1571. It appears in political conspiracies across every period of history. The architects tend to be mobile, wealthy, and well-connected enough to stay beyond reach. The instruments, the people who carry the letters and hold the cipher keys and sit across from interrogators in cold rooms, are the ones who face the machinery of justice directly. This is not an insight that resolves anything. It is simply a thing to notice and sit with. Let me bring together the main threads of what we've covered tonight, because this story has a lot of moving parts, and I want to leave you with something clear to carry forward. The Ridolfi plot was a 1571 scheme to remove Elizabeth I from the English throne. The plan called for Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, to marry Mary, Queen of Scots. It called for the Duke of Alba to land a Spanish invasion force on the English coast, timed to coincide with an internal Catholic uprising. Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker with exceptional access to the Catholic courts of Europe, organized it, lobbied the Pope and Philip II, and gave his name to the whole enterprise. William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal secretary, exposed it, beginning with the arrest of Charles Bailey at Dover in March of 1571. It was stopped before it came anywhere close to operational reality. The outcome was, by any ordinary measure of justice, deeply unequal. Norfolk, who was complicit but not the driving force, was executed. Mary, who was complicit and knew it, remained imprisoned for 16 more years and eventually died on a scaffold. And Ridolfi, who organized everything, spent the rest of his life in Florence, entered the Senate, outlived everyone, and died at 81. The man the conspiracy is named after was the only person it didn't touch. The bigger picture is also worth naming clearly. This plot didn't emerge from nowhere. It was made possible by a papal bull that gave theological cover for regicide, by Spain's geopolitical ambitions, and by the impossible legal position of Mary, Queen of Scots, a queen held without charge in a country that didn't quite know what to do with her. Elizabeth's refusal to execute Mary after the plot was exposed was not simply timidity or misplaced mercy. It was, at least in part, a principled refusal to execute an anointed queen, a position she held against enormous pressure for 16 years. That position cost her. Whether it was wisdom or a kind of principled stubbornness that became its own danger is a question the story leaves genuinely open, and I find I'm glad it does. And then there is the question about Cecil and Ridolfi that I don't think we'll ever fully settle. Did Cecil catch a conspiracy, or did he build one? Was Ridolfi England's most dangerous enemy, or its most useful asset? The answer may be both. Maybe neither, maybe somewhere in the careful gray space between. That ambiguity doesn't diminish the story. It deepens it. I find myself thinking, when I sit with this case for a while, about what it means that the figure at the center of one of history's more consequential plots is the one history has almost forgotten. Ridolfi's name is on the scheme, but very few people who aren't historians know who he was or what happened to him. The people we remember are Norfolk, Mary, Elizabeth, Cecil. The people who suffered and the people who endured. The man who walked away left so little behind him that even the question of his true allegiance is unresolved. History, I think, is sometimes like that. This podcast will be here whenever you want to come back to it. The next episode will be waiting for you, as calm and unhurried as tonight's, with another story that deserves to be told carefully. I'm glad you spent this time with me. I hope you're resting well wherever you are. History rarely gives us clean endings. The people whose names we remember are not always the ones who deserve to be remembered, and the ones who paid the highest prices are not always the ones who bore the most guilt. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do with a story like this is hold that thought gently, let it settle, and let it ask its own quiet questions of us. You've been with Cozy Crime tonight, historical crime told calmly, for rest and for curiosity. I hope the 16th century has been good company. Good night. There is something I want to return to before we truly leave this story, because I think I moved through certain parts of it more quickly than they deserved, and there are people in this account who deserve a little more time. Thomas Howard's early life tends to get compressed in histories of the Ridolfi plot, because it is the end of his story that history remembers. But understanding who he was before 1571 matters enormously if we want to understand how he got there. He was born in 1536, the year that Henry VIII began dissolving the monasteries, and England's break with Rome was already an accomplished fact. He grew up in a world that was changing with violent speed, where the faith of your household, the allegiance of your family, and the survival of your title were all fragile in ways that his grandfather's generation could not have predicted. The first Duke of Norfolk of his direct line had been attainted and executed. His own father had narrowly escaped execution at the very end of Henry VIII's reign, surviving only because Henry died before the warrant could be carried out. So Thomas Howard had inherited not only the dukedom and the wealth and the great East Anglian estates, but also a family history saturated with the knowledge of how quickly everything could be lost. He had grown up understanding, at some deep level, that proximity to power was dangerous, that rank did not confer immunity, that a title could be stripped as easily as it had been granted. And yet, despite all of that, despite the family memory of the block and the attainder, he convinced himself that he was different. That is the thing I keep coming back to. He had all the information a person would need to be cautious. He had watched it happen to people he was related to. He went ahead anyway. He had been married 3 times by the time the Ridolfi plot came to him. His first wife, Mary Fitzroy, died in 1557. His second wife, Margaret Audley, died in 1564, leaving him with several children. His third wife, Elizabeth Leyburn, died in 1567. He was 3 times widowed before he turned 40, which was not unusual for the 16th century, where illness took people with a thoroughness that later centuries would find appalling, but which must have shaped him in ways we can only guess at from this distance. He was not a cruel man by the accounts we have. He was generous to his household, attentive to his children, respected by the servants and tenants of his estates in a way that genuine fear alone could not have produced. His people, by most accounts, liked him. That matters. It is part of why his conviction and execution was felt as a real shock in the country, not just as the removal of a threat. His attraction to the idea of marrying Mary was probably never purely political, though the political logic was real enough. England had no settled succession. Elizabeth was unmarried. Mary had a legitimate claim. A marriage between the Duke of Norfolk and Mary Queen of Scots would, depending on how events unfolded, produce an heir with a stronger combined claim than either of them held alone. Norfolk had convinced himself, and it was not an entirely irrational conviction, that this marriage was actually what England needed, that he would be acting in the national interest, that his rank and his name and his established place in the English hierarchy would make him the ideal figure to bridge the Protestant and Catholic worlds that were threatening to tear the country apart. He had cast himself, in his own imagination, as a stabilizing force rather than a disruptive one. That self-image, I think, is why he kept going back to the idea even after he had been warned. He couldn't hear the warnings because he was so certain of his own good intentions. Mary herself was, by this point in her life, a woman who had learned to work with what she had and make the most of limited options. She was 28 in 1571. She had been a queen regnant of Scotland, had been widowed twice, had been forced to abdicate under duress, and had been imprisoned in England for 3 years. Her situation was genuinely terrible, and she knew it. She was not merely uncomfortable or inconvenienced. She was a reigning queen of a neighboring country held without charge, in an improvised captivity by a cousin who couldn't decide what to do with her. The limbo she inhabited had no legal basis that any 16th century lawyer would have been entirely comfortable defending, and Elizabeth's counsel knew this. Mary's response to that situation was not passive. She wrote letters constantly, maintained contacts at every Catholic court in Europe, presented herself as a wronged queen and a martyr of the faith, and made herself available through emissaries and intermediaries to anyone who wanted to use her name as a rallying point for opposition to Elizabeth. That is not a criticism. That was arguably the only thing she could do. A person with her background, her claims, and her genuine belief in her own right to rule was not going to sit quietly in a comfortable manor house and accept that her life as a political figure was finished. She was going to fight, using the only tools she had, which were her name, her religion, and the willingness of people like Ridolfi to see her as an instrument for their own purposes. The question of how much she understood about the violent elements of the plan is, as I said, something historians have found genuinely difficult. She authorized Ridolfi to negotiate on her behalf. She knew an invasion was contemplated. Beyond that, the picture becomes murkier, and I think we should resist the temptation to make it cleaner than the sources allow. Now, I want to stay a little longer with Roberto Ridolfi himself, because there is something about his character that the compressed version of this story tends to flatten. He was not simply a cynical opportunist, though he may have been that too. He was a man of genuine intelligence and considerable charm, who had built his career in the 16th century equivalent of high finance, which meant navigating the intersecting interests of rival Italian banking houses, Catholic courts, Protestant monarchies, and the always complicated politics of the papacy. He was good at reading rooms. He was good at presenting himself as a neutral facilitator, a broker of interests, rather than a partisan actor. That skill is part of what made him so effective in lobbying the Pope and Philip II. When he met with Pius V in Rome, he presented the English situation with, by all accounts, a confidence that probably exceeded what the facts warranted. He spoke of the English Catholics who would rise, of the ports that would be open to invasion, of Norfolk's readiness and the depth of popular Catholic sentiment in the North. He was, to use a word that is too generous, optimistic. The numbers he offered, the assessments of English Catholic military willingness, the timelines, all of these were projections built on hope and social intelligence rather than hard military fact. He was a banker and a diplomat. He understood money and conversation. He did not understand armies. The Duke of Alba understood armies. When Ridolfi came to him in the Netherlands with his plans and his confident projections, Alba listened and was not moved. His letters to Philip II from this period have a tone that I find quietly arresting, the tone of a military professional being asked to endorse a scheme by someone who has never had to think about supply lines or troop movements or what happens when an amphibious landing meets organized resistance. Alba wrote that Ridolfi was too free with information, that he had spoken too openly to too many people, that the plan had no serious logistical foundation, and that he, Alba, was not willing to risk the finest soldiers in Europe on the assurances of a banker who wanted to change the religion of England. That is a paraphrase, but it is not an unfair one. Philip II was, as he often was, interested in principle and non-committal in practice. He had his own reasons to want England weakened, his own memories of his marriage to Mary I, and his abortive attempt to remain a player in English politics after her death. He was also deeply cautious in ways that his image as the great champion of Catholic Europe sometimes obscures. He did not fund things he didn't believe would succeed, and he was receiving mixed signals, because Alba, his best general, was telling him this plan was poorly conceived, while Ridolfi was telling him it was certain to succeed. Philip did what kings in his position often did. He waited. That waiting was, in the end, part of what doomed the plot. There was never going to be a Spanish invasion force. Alba had made that clear. The internal Catholic uprising Ridolfi had promised was, if anything, even less certain than he had suggested, because most English Catholics were loyal to Elizabeth and had no interest in trading their relatively stable position under a Protestant queen for the chaos of civil war and foreign invasion. The Ridolfi plot was, in many respects, a plan that existed more convincingly on paper and in conversation than it ever could have in reality. But it didn't need to succeed to do damage. It needed only to exist, to be documented, to be exposed, and the existence and exposure did everything a failed plot needed to do. It destroyed Norfolk. It deepened the suspicion and legal jeopardy surrounding Mary. It hardened attitudes toward English Catholics as a class, who bore the suspicion that plots like this generated without having participated in them. And it gave Cecil exactly the political tools he needed to consolidate Elizabeth's government against the Catholic threat, internal and external, for the years that followed. Which is why the Bossy hypothesis, however carefully we need to hold it, has such a particular charge to it. If Cecil shaped this plot, or allowed it to run with full knowledge of where it was going, then the damage done to Norfolk, to Mary, to English Catholics broadly, was not an unfortunate consequence of a conspiracy that was caught. It was the point. The plot was the mechanism by which Cecil achieved what he wanted to achieve. The arrests, the cipher key under the tiles, the confession of the Bishop of Ross, all of it would be not intelligence work but theater, and the most consequential theater in Elizabethan political history. John Bossy is a careful and distinguished historian, and his argument in Under the Molehill deserves to be taken seriously, which is why I want to be equally clear that most historians in the mainstream of Tudor scholarship don't accept it as proven. The archival evidence is ambiguous in the way that genuinely covert operations tend to be ambiguous. You cannot prove a conspiracy from the absence of documents that such a conspiracy would never have generated. What Bossy points to is a pattern of timing and outcome that is, at minimum, striking and at maximum suggestive of a level of orchestration that would fundamentally change how we read Cecil's role in this entire episode. For what it is worth, my own sense of it, and I offer this simply as a feeling rather than a historical judgment, is that Cecil was probably not running Ridolfi as an agent from the beginning, but that he almost certainly became aware of the plot's existence earlier than the official record suggests, and that he made a calculated decision to let it run until the moment when it would do him the most good. That is not the same as building the conspiracy from scratch. It is something more subtle, and in some ways more troubling. It means that the people who suffered, who were arrested, who confessed, who were executed, suffered at a moment of Cecil's choosing rather than of chance. Whether that distinction matters morally, I'll leave for you to sit with. What I am confident in saying is that the Ridolfi plot was not, primarily, a story about Roberto Ridolfi. He was the catalyst, the traveling salesman of revolution, the man who made it seem plausible in papal corridors and Spanish antechambers. But the story was really about the fault lines in Elizabethan England, the unsettled succession, the imprisoned Scottish queen, the tension between England's Protestant establishment and its Catholic minority, and the question of whether Elizabeth's government could hold all of these pressures in tension long enough for the Protestant settlement to become genuinely irreversible. Cecil believed it could. His entire career was dedicated to making it so. Every conspiracy that was exposed and punished made the Protestant establishment more secure. Every execution or imprisonment of a Catholic claimant or conspirator narrowed the space for future plots. The Ridolfi plot was, in this reading of history, not a failure of intelligence, but a success of governance. However uncomfortable the human cost of that success was to look at directly. The human cost is worth looking at directly, though, because a history that only describes political outcomes is not giving us the full picture. Norfolk was 46 years old and had children who were now without a father. His title was attainted with him, which meant his surviving family carried the consequences of his choices for years afterward. The servants and retainers of Howard House, people who knew nothing of ciphers or papal bulls or Spanish invasions, found themselves connected to a convicted traitor's household and bore whatever social and economic consequences that entailed. Charles Bailey, who started all of this when he stepped off a boat at Dover, spent time in the Marshalsea and was broken on the rack, which was a thing that happened to him in his body and would not simply stop happening when he left the room. He survived. History doesn't tell us much about what the rest of his life looked like. He disappears from the record, which is itself a kind of answer. And then there is John Leslie, the Bishop of Ross, who lived with whatever it meant to have said what he reportedly said about his own queen. He was eventually allowed to leave England and go to France, and then to Rome, where he spent years working on behalf of Mary's cause with an energy that looked very much like penance. He wrote a history of Scotland. He produced theological arguments in her defense. He lobbied Catholic courts on her behalf, with a persistence that suggests either that his reported betrayal has been overstated by sources hostile to him, or that he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for something he knew he had done. He died in 1596, 9 years after Mary was executed, and I find myself unable to read his later career without wondering what he carried with him. The Ridolfi plot exists at the intersection of several things I find genuinely fascinating about the 16th century. It sits at the point where religion and politics became, for a time, completely indistinguishable from each other, where the question of who would be king or queen was also the question of what kind of eternity you could expect, and where the decision to support or oppose a monarch was interpreted by some as a theological obligation, rather than merely a political one. The papal bull of 1570 made all of this explicit in a way that was at once grand and catastrophically dangerous for the people caught in its wake. It also sits at the intersection of two very different kinds of historical figure: the person who moves through history, leaving their name on things without ever quite being caught by the consequences, and the person who carries the weight of those consequences entirely without having been the primary cause of them. Ridolfi is the first kind. Norfolk, Bailey, Leslie, Mary, all of them in different ways, are the second. That pattern is not a 16th century pattern. It is a human one, which is, I suppose, part of why these old stories continue to ask questions that feel surprisingly immediate. Let me bring the main threads of tonight's story together, because I've carried you through quite a lot of ground, and I want to leave you with something clear and settled to rest with. The Ridolfi plot was a 1571 conspiracy to remove Elizabeth I from the English throne through a combination of a Spanish invasion and an internal Catholic uprising, with Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, as the intended new monarchs of England. Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker of exceptional nerve and limited military understanding, organized it, lobbied the Pope and the King of Spain, and gave it his name. It was exposed primarily through the arrest of Charles Bailey at Dover in March of 1571, the subsequent interrogation of John Leslie, Bishop of Ross, and the discovery of a cipher key beneath the tiles of an outhouse at Howard House in London. Norfolk was convicted of high treason and executed on the 2nd of June, 1572. The outcome, as I've tried to stay honest about tonight, was strikingly unequal. The man whose name the plot carries was the only person it didn't destroy. Ridolfi died at 81 in Florence, a member of the city's Senate, comfortable and largely forgotten, except as a footnote in English history books. Norfolk died at 46 on Tower Hill. Mary remained imprisoned for 16 more years and was eventually executed in 1587 following the Babington plot. The people who carried letters and held ciphers and confessed under pressure bore consequences that Ridolfi never did. The larger question the plot raises, the one about whether Cecil caught a conspiracy or quietly helped to build one, remains genuinely open, and I want to be honest that it may never be fully answered. What we can say is that Cecil was present at every stage of the conspiracy's exposure in ways that showed either exceptional intelligence work or exceptional foreknowledge. John Bossie's argument that Ridolfi was a double agent working for Cecil from as early as 1569 is serious scholarship that most historians find interesting without finding it proven. I think the honest position is to hold the question open and let it do the work that unanswerable questions do, which is to keep us humble about how much we actually know. Elizabeth's refusal to execute Mary after the plot was exposed was not timidity, though it cost her. It was a principled position, held at genuine political risk, that executing an anointed queen was something she would not do. That position held for 16 years. Whether it was wisdom or a kind of moral conviction that created as many problems as it solved depends partly on which moment you are looking at and partly on what you think principles are for. I'm glad you came to spend this hour with me in the 16th century. It is not always a comfortable place to spend time. The people in these stories made choices under pressures that are hard to fully imagine, and they paid prices that were frequently out of all proportion to their individual culpability. But they were real people, with families and ambitions and fears, and I think they deserve to be remembered as that rather than simply as pieces on someone else's board. The next episode will be here whenever you're ready for it. There is no urgency, no deadline, no pressure to return before you're ready. This podcast will wait for you, unhurried, the way a good book waits on a shelf. If you found something here tonight that gave you something to think about, or simply helped you rest, then the evening has done what it set out to do. Thank you for your company. The 16th century is full of stories that resist clean resolution, people who escaped consequences they deserved, people who bore consequences they didn't, and moments when the distinction between intelligence and conspiracy collapses into something we don't have a comfortable name for. History rarely ties itself neatly. The people we remember are not always the ones who should have been remembered, and the ones who walk away from the wreckage don't always walk away because they were innocent. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is sit with that quietly, let it ask its questions, and not insist on answers that the evidence doesn't give us. You've been listening to Cozy Crime, historical crime told calmly, for rest and for curiosity. Good night.
Pull up the quilt and turn down the light. Old crooked stories to tuck you in tonight. This is Cozy Crime. Close your eyes, we'll borrow time. Little clues from long ago drift away, we'll keep it slow. Cozy Crime, where the past past unwinds, and you sleep through every twist.